In terms of the order today, I'm going to hand over first to Dr. Michelle Walsh, who's the RCNI clinical lead. And this report, she's going to walk us through the findings. This report is derived almost entirely, well, the findings themselves entirely, from a thesis, a recent PhD thesis. And after that, we are really privileged to have with us the Ombudsman for Children, Niall Muldoon, and the Child Rapporteur, the Government Child Rapporteur, Conor. We're really privileged to have both of them here today to reflect on these findings and also their own work in this area and what they have been highlighting themselves even before they saw these findings and how these findings move us forward. The other bit I have to do here is to say thank you to a number of people, obviously to Michelle Walsh herself in terms of her thesis, but I also want to thank Youth Work Ireland and Foróige, who facilitated and supported the young people and indeed particularly youth workers who participated in this research and gave us these insights. There were 600 young people in total who took part in this research. The PhD thesis, for those of you who've ever had the pain of going through it, this is a 631-page document. So we are presenting today a 33-page report derived from that PhD. That took some considerable amount of work to take that down to 33 pages for you today. And I have to thank the RCNI team who worked into that, and in particular Elaine Mears on the team who wrestled with those statistics to bring them to you in the form you see them today. Of course, the most important people to thank are the people who took part in that research. Michelle is going to tell you what they told her very, very shortly, but I want to tell you one of those statistics that they told us, because although what Michelle is going to lay out for you is fairly grim in terms of prevalence and in terms of the experiences of adolescents and sexual harassment, we also asked them about their hope for the future, or Michelle did. And I'll give you one of those stats. 81% of adolescents, when asked if they felt that they had the power to combat sexual harassment, said yes. Said yes, they did not believe for 1 second that this was how it needed to be, how it ought to be, and that they believed they could change it. But they did also say that they needed support to do so. And that is what we have tried to lay out in the recommendations. We have looked at what would that support look like, what do we need to put in place so that the adolescents can achieve the faith that they have in their futures, and it's a future that is free of sexual harassment. In terms of, we're at a very opportune time because we have the third national strategy on domestic sexual and gender-based violence being written within the Department of Justice. It's a whole of government strategy. And we really hope that these recommendations and the voice of these adolescents makes it into that strategy in terms of really concrete actions that will give the adolescents that support that they have clearly asked for here in this research. The first thing I'm going to do as I hand over to Dr. Michelle Walsh to tell you the findings is we're going to hear first from one of the participants in that research. This is an adolescent girl who took part in the research, and shortly after taking part in the research, she wrote a poem. If the adolescents' plea and indeed hope for the future and their sense of empowerment into the future isn't sufficient, one of the other motivations, if you like, for us is that we have known since Savvy in 2002 that if a child is abused as a young child, that there is a likelihood, indeed a 16-fold likelihood, that they will be abused further and again as they move through their life stages. This is one of the reasons why intervention is really critical, because we can break that cycle, both in terms of being targeted of victimization, but also in terms of the young people who are perpetrating the sexual violence on their peers. So the survivor here wished to remain anonymous. And so the poem today is being read by a young 16-year-old girl named Emma O'Brien. So I would like to thank both of them as I hand over to Dr. Michelle, who's going to share screen now and play that video for you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. A bit of feedback. Oh, just hope that settled.
It has.
It has. Okay, great. So, as Cliona said, thank you very, very much for coming today. And I think it's very, very important as we start that we remember that every statistic that I'm going to show you, there is a young person behind them. And I started this data collection in May 2018, collected data for 12 months. And I remember the first day, it was a beautiful, sunny, warm May day. And I remember going into a youth club in Dublin and meeting my first three participants and coming out and being absolutely shocked and bowled over by what I'd heard and thinking, my God, you better not be asking these adolescents for this information if you're not going to do something about it. And I think this poem replicates some of the horrific stories that I heard over the data collection time.
I was sexually assaulted when I was 6 years old. Until very recently, I thought nothing of it. Everyone has a weird cousin, right? Crazy inside jokes just between you guys as a family. It happens, everyone. Who was I to know that my experiences were anything more than that? Every secret meeting was backed up with giggles and jokes, touches were tickles, and we were the best of friends. He made me feel special and like I was the best little girl in the world, and I cherished that feeling. I've spent the last decade searching for that feeling, begging to feel wanted, through self-harm, through binge eating, through sex. Yet here we are, basking in an emptiness I've come to accept as a reality. I can remember so vividly the encounters I had with him. Let's go play a game behind the turf shed. So, like a dog, I patted obediently behind him, giggling. I was his favourite, you see, and that's all that mattered. My experience with sexual abuse is something I'm still only coming to terms with, something I want to brush under the rug and forget about again, but I can't. Sexual assault isn't always just touching. It's a memory, a psychological mark that is relentless in its presence. A strange thing I've noticed about myself over the last week or so is how I was so unaware until I wasn't anymore. He never left a mark on my body, he only scarred my mind. It's like I always thought that this scar was a birthmark, and now I can't look at it the same way, and I never will. We all go on a journey of self-acceptance. For some, a brisk stroll through a park, occasionally tarnished by thorns. For others, a boat ride through a storm, each wave of emotion crashing through you on what seems like a never-ending quest for stability. But we all get there in the end. Though each journey is unique, each struggle is different, and each person shrouded in loneliness, none of us are alone. It is not a battle of whose journey is hardest, not a competition of whose scars run deeper or whose sky has the most clouds. It is instead a relentless fight against a common enemy, a revolution against the abuse and the people who take advantage of the children they are trusted with. We as youth are not looking for your sympathy, but instead empathy. Do not pity the child who has grown up with thick skin, but instead help her ensure no other child will be forced to grow up too fast the way she was forced to. Native American proverb states, "We do not inherit our earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children." Let us make a world we are proud to hand over, a world they will not want to give back.
So, and on we go to storm and stress. So my PhD looked at the experiences and understanding of adolescents and sexual harassment. And we named the report Storm and Stress because storm and stress is the period in adolescence that Coleman talks about. It's that struggle in adolescence where a child tries to, I suppose, identify themselves, create autonomy and transition from childhood into adulthood. And as we all know, being through it, it often is a time of storm and stress. So the first thing, I suppose, to give you some context before we go into the findings of the study, is I'm going to talk to you about the people that took part in the study. So the adolescent participants, we had 59% that were female and 41% that were male. And I divided the adolescents, the age range was 13 to 17. So obviously, you know, there was a massive stretch. So I divided them into two age groups. So the younger adolescents are 13 to 15-year-old category, and they accounted for 36% of the participants. And then the larger category was 64%, and they were the 16 and 17-year-old adolescents. 13% of the adolescents within the study were LGBTQ, and the other 37% or 87%, sorry, were straight or identified as straight. Again, with the youth workers, 67% of the youth workers, I had 22 youth workers in the study. At that stage, I'd reached data saturation. But to be fair, I suppose it is worth saying that if I kept collecting data, I could have kept going. There was so much interest in adolescents in taking part in this study. They so wanted to have their voices heard. But as I say, with the youth workers, 67 were female and the other 33% were male. And they ranged from 22 to 61 years of age. And 76% of them were between the age group of 20 and 40. 90.5%, gosh, that's an odd figure, isn't it, when you look at it in terms of a whole person, were straight. And the remaining 9.5% were LGBTQ+. So I suppose the best way, what I did with the findings of the study was, when I was considering the lit review for the study, I reviewed an awful lot of frameworks that looked at adolescents and their development and the challenges that they met in that development and what contributed to them. And it became evident that looking at this through an ecological lens, so looking at the individual person, the interpersonal, the relationships that they had, the relationships that they had within community and society, was the best way and the most appropriate way to do this. So from that, I developed an ecological framework, and I presented my findings in two parts. So the first part of this ecological framework is the understanding of the issues that contribute to sexual harassment, and the second part is the recommendations. So how do we respond to adolescent sexual harassment? And we'll get to that as we go along. So it became very apparent as well that sexual harassment has a very, very big relationship to social norms, gender norms, and then that feeds up into policy and practice. And sexual harassment absolutely exists on a continuum. Nobody wakes up one morning and just decides to rape somebody. It starts with minor forms of behavior that escalate over time. And I think that that's very important to consider in terms of adolescence. So I suppose for the first part, before we start looking at the findings, we need to know what is sexual harassment. So what is sexual harassment in terms of what I asked the adolescents in this question, in this study. So there's a broad spectrum of behaviors that can be included in sexual harassment. So the definition that I went with is sexual harassment is unwanted sexual, verbal and non-verbal behaviors which draw on gender-based beliefs and sexist hostility. It can range from unwanted banter, jokes, comments, gestures, and unwelcome sexual advances, unwanted, unwelcome, or uninvited sexual contact. In this report, that means to act up to and include rape. This is a behavior which violates a person's dignity and creates intimidating, hostile, degrading, and an offensive environment. And I suppose it's also really worth considering that when I started out to do this study, to get ethical approval to do it in NUI in Galway, obviously if I said, right, I'm going to ask people about sexual violence, there was absolutely no way that I would have done that ethically or morally, or I don't think I would have got the ethical permission to do it either. So that's why I said, let's look at sexual harassment. Let's look at the milder forms of sexual harassment and see what happens. But what actually happened was the adolescents came forward and they told me of experiences that went way beyond catcalling, name calling, and general low-grade harassment. And to be fair, I really think that their voices had to be respected, and that had to be included in this report. So, why is sexual harassment so important? Why do we bother? What's the point? It's the impact. And I suppose within RCNI, we're looking at that every day of the week. And I come from, I'm a counsellor, a psychotherapist, and a clinical supervisor. And I've been working in rape crisis for the last 11 years. And I am so tired of seeing children coming through me, coming through my practice, like the girl in the poem, with their lives utterly destroyed. And you see things like self-harm, panic attacks, eating disorders, problems socializing, academic underperformance. Like sexual harassment impacts every area of an adolescent's life, from long-term to short-term to how they're going to perform for the rest of their lives. It's not just a problem in school. The problems in school result in the underperformance, not realizing their full potential, physically or emotionally or financially. So that's why this study is important. Okay. So why do they perpetrate sexual harassment? What did I find? What type of harmful behaviors present in adolescents? And again, these are on a continuum. Okay, so individually, the skills, the values, and the psychological traits that I found were most prominent in perpetration of sexual violence were the gender and expectations, the personality and character traits that we get as we grow up, the personal values, the knowledge and the moral reasoning, and the self-efficacy. And the moral reasoning and the knowledge, obviously we get that at home, a lot of it, until we get to the peer stage, where then we're probably more influenced by our peers. Self-esteem and emotional regulation. And then that's at an individual level, but what are our adolescents exposed to environmentally? So what processes or what social predictors are most prominent when we talk about sexual harassment? And again, gender norms are a big part of this. Parental modeling. So what do they get? What do they learn at home? Siblings, family dynamics, the peers that they interact with, popularity among school friends and groups, school itself, the social background where they come from, the culture that they're immersed in, the media exposure that they have, and affiliation to sports groups and other groups and activities. All of these things have a massive impact on sexual harassment and its development and continuum within society. So sexual harassment isn't an individual or an individualized problem or a problem among adolescents. It's a societal problem, and it really needs to be looked at from this point of view, I think. So we'll head into the findings, and these are fairly grim. I'm sorry. So I asked the adolescents, where do they think most sexual harassment happens? 42% are telling me online. We have another 4% that said home. 23% are saying friends, and 12% are saying school. Now, I think it's very important as well that we don't look at any of these figures in absolute isolation, because in terms of friends in school, where do kids mix with their friends is only in school. Pubs and clubs, we're talking 13 to 17-year-olds. 6% said other locations. They could be out walking around in town, they could be in the park. And 3% of adolescents didn't respond. So we definitely have a very large online problem. But then I suppose if you couple that with where is it happening, if I'm talking about peer and peer abuse, it's happening with their friends. So you could nearly put the 42 and the 23% together, depending on the way that you want to address this. So I asked the adolescents to rate the levels and types of sexual harassment they had experienced within the last 12 months. And 20% of the adolescents are telling me that they didn't experience any sexual harassment. Now, these are all, everything on this scale is things that they didn't want to see or they didn't want to be exposed to. So sexual jokes and comments, mild sexual jokes and comments that they didn't think were particularly funny, 30% of the adolescents were exposed or had experienced that. Sexting, seeing images or being sent images that they didn't want to see, and that's the most important thing here, is 26% of our adolescents. Physical behaviours, including sexual advances, touching, and various forms of sexual assault, so 20%. I mean, I've had kids coming up and telling me about being so homophobically bullied in school and harassed that they had to leave. And then we had 3% that what they discussed with me is rape, and aggravated rape in a lot of cases. So I then asked the adolescents, what had they witnessed? So if you haven't experienced sexual violence, have you witnessed it happening among your peer group? And they're nearly a mirror image, the two graphs. And again, this is things that they didn't want to see that has happened within the last 12 months. And in fact, only 17% of adolescents are saying that they haven't witnessed any form of sexual harassment within the last 12 months. Sexual comments and jokes, mild comments and jokes that they didn't think were funny, was 24%. And sexting, seeing images or being sent them, their friends being sent the images, was at 30%. Physical behaviours, including sexual advances, touching, and various forms of assault, 23%. I had one young lady that told me that she had to rescue her friend who was drunk at a house party to stop some boys after they laid her down on the bed and talked to her, taking turns. And I had another boy in another part of the country tell me that they look for the drunkest adolescent in the party and they target her. And again, we're at 5% who have actually seen one of their peers been raped or seriously sexually assaulted. So that's fairly shocking. So I started to dive into the figures then, and I looked at a comparison in younger and older adolescents. And the older adolescents were 2.17 times more likely to report that they had been forced to do something sexual against their will. Older adolescents were 1.83 times more likely to experience inappropriate touch, non-consensual touching. And older adolescents again were 1.96 times more likely than younger adolescents to agree that sexual harassment happened in their peer community. And you see one of the comments there from the adolescents. It's just the way it is. Like you could be standing there talking to your friend and some guy will just grab you or whatever. Like you just have to push them off or whatever. So it's kind of accepted. That's just what boys do. Like it's hard because no one's going to do anything. It happens to everyone at least once. Gender. Girls are subjected to much higher levels of sexual harassment than boys. So girls are 2.11 times more likely than boys to report that they experience some unwanted sexual comments. They're 2.49 times more likely to experience unwanted sexual touches, and 1.92 times more likely to experience online sexual harassment than boys. They're 1.5 times more likely to agree that sexual harassment occurs within their peer community. And boys, on the other hand, are 1.92 times more likely to expose to homophobic name calling than girls. And again, this is one of the participants that I talked to. So he brought me away from the playground where everyone was and he started trying to touch me. I pushed him off and he kept pushing me back. I pushed him away and I started to cry and he was like, your friend told me you wanted to do this. So that to me says an awful lot about education and autonomy. But on we go. Adolescents who are LGBTQ are subjected to much higher levels of sexual harassment than their heterosexual counterparts. So they're 2.95 times more likely to have experienced unwanted sexual comments compared to straight adolescents. They're 1.97 times more likely to be forced into a non-consensual sexual experience than the straight adolescents. And they're 1.99 times more likely to experience inappropriate or unwanted touching. And they're 2.73 times more likely than respondents who had to identify as straight to agree that sexual harassment occurs within their adolescent peer community. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit tongue-tied there. And homophobic name calling is by no means confined to the LGBTQ community. And the use of homophobic slurs against straight adolescents is part of a general homophobic atmosphere that is created and maintained. However, LGBT and adolescents were 11.81 times more likely to have direct experience of being called gay or lesbian in a negative way. 11.81 times. 68% of those who identified as LGBT plus experienced serious sexual harassment, compared with 20% of the whole population in this study. That's absolutely shocking. Again, you see one of the comments there. I think because a lot of my friends being LGBT, it happens a lot more. Like it's almost every one of my close friends has experienced some sort of sexual harassment. So to summarize them, in a 12-month period, 80% of adolescents disclosed being subjected to some form of sexual harassment. 24% of adolescents disclosed that they were subjected to physical or extreme forms of sexual harassment. And 83% of adolescents witnessed some form of sexual harassment. And you know what shocked me was this comment here. I had so many, and this is just one of several. And this isn't a clap on the back for me. This is really, it's shocking. It's always other causes. You never hear of anybody coming up to our age group and looking for our opinion on what you're doing right now. I really appreciate what you're doing. I just wanted to say thank you. I had so many questionnaires. There's 27 questions on the questionnaires that I gave to the 599 adolescents. And I could tell you that there is at least 50 to 60 of those that have thank you written on the end of it. And that's humbling and it's shocking. In a 12-month period, 28% of adolescents witnessed physical or extreme forms of sexual harassment. 78% of adolescents participated that sexual harassment occurred within their community. And our youth workers, 100%, all of the youth workers who participated in the study stated that they had witnessed harassment with levels varying from verbal to extreme forms of sexual harassment. This one youth work participant, I don't think what she said to me, I don't think it'll ever leave my head. And to be honest with you, the language, the way that she was spoke to, this is really dumbed down for PhD. I actually had to cancel 2 groups because of being harassed myself. In the end, it was a decision. I had to say, I'm no longer going to be with this group because of the way I've been treated by these young people. At the time of the group, I was actually pregnant. And there was a lot of comments of how often did I have sex to get pregnant? And would I have sex with them? So I was coming into work knowing that I was facing this. And very, very little support for them when they do come into work. In a 12-month period, 57% of the youth workers experienced sexual harassment from an adolescent while they were at work. One of the youth workers who experienced this sexual harassment at work said to me, I felt I had nothing I couldn't give them. I had no positive influence, and that's how I saw it. I had my own limitations because I was female at the time and I had nothing good to bring to these people. So she actually stopped working. So we move on to looking at my ecological framework. So I've framed what we need to understand from an ecological point of view, looking at the individual or the microsystem. So the individual at the start. What do we need to understand that needs to happen with adolescents that contributes to sexual harassment, I suppose, first. And it's their personal beliefs and their experiences that are shaped by their interpersonal connections. That's where it starts. At an interpersonal level, it includes the beliefs and the systems and experiences of close family, friends, the relationships, and they are again shaped by the interpersonal connections. So families, parents, guardians, carers, friends, all these people that interact. And it's the belief systems and the interactions that happen at this level that are attributed to, I suppose, fueling sexual harassment. And then at a community level, what's happening within community that's contributing to sexual harassment? And it's the belief systems and the youth workers, the educators and the teachers, the lack of education, I could say. I mean, I know that one of the findings that isn't presented here is that 63% of the adolescents said that they would not know how to report sexual harassment if they experienced it in school. A similar number said that they didn't know if their school had a sexual harassment policy, and 36% of the adolescents said that they had received no formal RSE education at all. Social care organisations, community organisations, sports organisations, healthcare professionals, legal professionals. Everything that's happening within these community levels at the moment, an awful lot of the belief systems and the interpersonal connections are contributing to an environment that fosters sexual harassment. And at a societal level, what's happening that's contributing to sexual harassment? The policies that we don't have within our government departments. The policy makers need to look at actually what are the implications of the policies that we have. Mass media and entertainment, what's happening? The influence of porn, internet providers, lawmakers, are our laws fit for purpose? And religious organisations, what type of belief systems are we handing down? And then there's the intergenerational piece. So the intergenerational piece for me is when you take our norms and our practices and our structures and you look at them from what happens from our generation to the next. And in terms of sexual harassment, we're going downhill, I believe. And we really, really need to look at what are we going to do to address this. So there is some good news. Responding to sexual harassment, because they've asked us to and they believe in us. 81% of participants felt that they with the support of their peer group had the power to combat sexual harassment. And with that, and 84% of adolescents in this study felt that they, including their parents, teachers and friends and influential adults, had the power to overcome sexual harassment. So with that now I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand you over to Tina, who's going to look at what we need to do to combat sexual harassment.
Thank you very much. And I'm just going to very quickly, because as I said, when we responded to those findings that Michelle has just, some of the findings that Michelle has walked you through there, we had to look at what are our recommendations. We based it around Michelle's ecological model that she's just walked you very quickly through there. We are, as I said, we have an opportunity here to build actions into the national strategy that is being written at the moment. And I do believe that it is time for us to really lock down those actions. The first time that the RCNI looked at this was in 2013, when we separated out early childhood and the older child in terms of their experiences of sexual harassment. from data from rape crisis centres and Carry. And from then on, we have been advocating for something focused around the adolescent to be put in place, because it's clear that they need something that is bespoke and that is targeted specifically at adolescents. So in terms of the ecological model, moving very quickly through, and I will move quickly through because I really want to come to our other two panelists, we have, we know that if we make these changes now, they will have an impact generation on generation. There is, and if we do nothing, that the legacy of that we leave behind is the negative legacy. I can, is this my share screen now? I'm not moving. There we are. In terms of the societal model and the societal level of the ecological model, the first thing is how we message, and this has already started. We already have national campaigns coming from government around how we shape our norms and beliefs in society around sexual violence, the things that facilitate sexual violence. We would say that in terms of adolescents, we really need to focus on things like drugs, alcohol use, pornography, and online sexual violence. There are still gaps in our legislation, and this is something that's an ongoing piece of work. There is work happening in the Oireachtas at the moment, and what we really want to see, alongside our other partners in the NGO sector and led by the Children's Rights Alliance, is an individual complaints mechanism and an online safety commissioner as part of that work on online safety. We also really, and I think really need to give this its own bit of space here, we need to ensure intervention programs for children, for adolescents. We know that they can be very effective. We know no child is born a perpetrator, and we know that if we intervene in terms of changing the messaging they've already absorbed from their culture, the negative messaging, that we can really make a difference, and we can stop that process in its tracks if we intervene effectively with teenagers. Again, we really need this to be something that is actioned and visible, that we're counting, that we're monitoring, that we're reviewing, and that we're making sure we're actually doing this work. And we need to do that formally within the national strategy, I would suggest. One of the most important asks that we have, and it's by no means the only ask, is our school systems. And we tend to focus a lot on schools, but of course, as Michelle has pointed out, a child's world is much bigger than their schools, but the schools play a very important part. It is not sufficient for us to simply look at and focus on the curriculum content. That is only one small aspect of what we need to be taking care of. Some of the recommendations and some of the findings that Michelle spoke about in terms of young people don't know where to report. They don't know if the schools have a policy. They don't know who's there to respond and to support them. All of those things need to be clarified, and we believe it's time that they're clarified in a national framework of some form that looks and counts and makes sure that every school is supported in responding appropriately at every level to sexual harassment, and that's proactively as well as reactively. And again, that we would really like to see that pinned down within the national strategy. In terms of the community level, it's very simple. We need to be there for adolescents when they need us. And there's two steps to that. One is there needs to be clear referral pathways. Children need to know where to go. Parents need to know where to go. Schools, organisations, professionals, anyone working with and alongside and encountering adolescents need to know where to go. And of course, the second step there is that when they go somewhere, that space is resourced and is there and ready and able to meet those needs, whatever they may be. And that's about specialist services for adolescents. It's not sufficient to continue to, what we discovered, one of the things in 2013 was we realized the rape crisis sector was one of the, in fact, in the NGO sector, the biggest provider of services for children, yet we were an adult service essentially. So we have of course that specialization around adolescents, but that is we have built that organically, and it really needs to become a structure that is supported nationally in every rape crisis centre and in every county in Ireland. In terms of the interpersonal, again, one of the really key pieces here is about the listening to the adolescents. As Michelle said, she went in to talk to adolescents about sexual harassment and they told her about rape. We have to be listening and we have to be paying attention. One of the barriers that there has been to this kind of data with young people has been our reluctance to speak to young people about their experiences of sex and indeed of sexual violence. And we really have to find ways to really be able to give them a space, a safe space where they can tell us about the experience that is their lived reality. And we very much need to support the parents. And one of the pieces, of course, here is that we need to give them tools around the online space. And that's not just about parents, that's about the platforms, the companies that are in this space, as well as the legislation, as well as how parents themselves engage here. And of course, the biggest one to come back to, and this is at an individual level, how we engage with gender norms and negative gender norms is really key. Gender equality is at the absolute heart of how we combat sexual violence in our society. So I don't want to keep you too long, as I said, so I'm just flew through that. What I will say is the report is available online. It's available on our website at the moment, rcni.ie, and indeed the video that we showed you earlier will also be available online. And so without much further ado, I want to hand you over first to the Ombudsman for Children. The Ombudsman for Children has been focused on this for a very long time, and I would say it's an area of particular expertise for him. So we're very pleased to have him here. And he also recently spoke at the Oireachtas, the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Education and Skills, on some of these questions that we have raised today. So I'm really looking forward to your response today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Conor. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you very much to everyone for attending, and I'm delighted to be speaking at the launch of the Rape Crisis Network Ireland report, Storm and Stress. Personally, I believe it's a very timely report, and it's very strong recommendations, and it serves to really highlight an area of today's youth culture that has been ignored for too long. I also want to commend Dr. Michelle Walsh for her sterling efforts on the research. Speaking with or surveying nearly 600 teenagers, going on to interview over 90 of them, and then speaking with the very importantly with 21 youth workers. It creates a real robust data. For me, some of the findings that stood out are depressingly familiar for anyone who's worked in this area before. The fact that girls were subjected to higher levels of sexual harassment than boys, more than double. Adolescents who identified as gay or pansexual were subjected to higher levels of sexual harassment than those who were heterosexual. Indeed, 68% experienced serious sexual harassment versus 20% of the overall group population. That's a really strong finding. And then teens aged 16 to 17 were subjected to much higher levels of sexual harassment. And the fact that and again, Michelle highlighted it very well, that the continuum of harassment from mild and moderate, and again, even that's a difficult thing to consider. Sexual comments and jokes, sexting, seeing sexual images, being sent those sexual images unwarranted or unwanted. That's mild and moderate. And then the serious sexual harassment itself then constitutes sexual assault, extreme sexual harassment, and rape. And again, huge numbers. It's harrowing reading to recognize that 24% of adolescents have experienced some sort of serious sexual harassment in the last 12 months. And even the 3% that Michelle talked about, out of the 600 young people that she spoke to that were surveyed, that brings 18 people into the concept of rape. That's stark, very, very stark. And again, as a psychologist, I've worked with very many of the victims of sexual assault, but it's distressing just to be reminded of the impact of such an experience can have on those young people and how long lasting it is. And again, Michelle highlighted things like low self-esteem, depression, problems with body image, eating disorders, loneliness, problems regulating emotions, all those things that build up in the future and last for a long, long time unless it's helped at the earliest possible stage. And for me, then I looked at the three areas, the top three areas where harassment happens. And young people say that they've seen harassment. That's online, 42%, with friends, 23%, and in schools, 12%. And again, Michelle is very clear in saying that, wherever groups of adolescents gather, that's where harassment will happen. So we have to recognize that it clearly shows that we need to tackle this issue on a number of fronts. Online is crucial, in schools is crucial, and in the relationships that people have across adolescence. Each of those areas suggests that the way a teenager learns and understands their world has got to have a clearer and more specific input around gender and sexual mores and appropriate behaviours. This is the truth, both of the virtual and the real world that our children and adolescents inhabit. And we know very well that those terms are more enmeshed now than they ever have been for any cohort of children in the past. The rapid rise in technology has seen a huge upsurge in new forms of image-based assault taking place on platforms most parents and teachers have never heard of. The dizzying speed with which certain social media sites and apps fall in and out of favour with young people can make parents feel inept and anxious as they try to protect their children online. It's clear that schools and the RSE curriculum are struggling to keep pace with these rapid changes and the dangers that arise for children and young people who may have their most intimate messages and photos leaked, not just to their schoolmates and peers, but sometimes to the whole world. It is, in fact, a staggering thing for most parents and teachers to comprehend, but nevertheless, we need to find a way to give young people the skills to navigate this new element of adolescence, because it's not going to go away just because the parents' generation don't like it. For example, in November of last year, just over 6 months ago, hundreds of thousands of intimate images of Irish women were released online on a platform called Discord without their consent. Some of the images were leaked from private social media accounts of adults, while many of the images were derived from private minors' profiles without their consent. We in the Ombudsman for Children's Office are members of the European Network of Ombudsman for Children, where there's 32 countries and 40 different offices involved in that across Europe. We signed a joint statement on children in the digital environment in September 2019. It's a statement that we sent to all the European governments. And within that, we did a number of recommendations, but I just want to highlight one in relation to the online world and it has a couple of subsections. But we made a recommendation that requires all governments, business and industries to respect and fully support children's rights in the digital environment. And that include ensuring all platforms, providers, services, devices and products are subject to regulation and oversight which protects children's rights. So we want to really put the concept of children's rights to the heart of all those businesses that are in high tech, IT and social media businesses, so that we can really make sure that children's rights are at the core of what they do and how they regulate it. Second recommendation we had was increase oversight of emerging technologies. And these are crucial because I think they change so quickly. Technologies such as geolocation, connected devices, profiling, artificial intelligence, facial recognition software, machine learning and algorithms. If we can keep an oversight on them as they emerge, then that can be crucial. And again, you do that within the concept of children's rights. But again, simple things like nowadays, we have beautiful cuddly toys with technology built in where the camera through one of the eyes can recognize the face of the child that's picking them up and can say, hello, Mary, hello, John, hello, Michael, and create a personal relationship. But it also builds up data in the interactions and learns how to use that data for individuals. We have to be careful of how they also connect with Alexa and how they connect with cars, how they collect information on a totality of things that children interact with. Being aware of that. And then finally, again, just one of the recommendations was produce child-friendly and accessible guidelines, codes and terms. So again, putting children's rights at the heart of what IT and social media companies do, creating all terms and conditions written in child-friendly language for anybody under 12. Adults can ask for a separate version, but all standard recommendations and conditions and guidelines are created in child-friendly language. And as we're discussing sexual harassment and recognize that over 40% of it occurs online, we've got to accept the truth that for all of our children born after the year 2000, the online world is their real world as well. Regulation of it is vital for the Irish government to come to terms with. But helping children and teenagers to understand and navigate it should be priority for all of society, from parents through to sports clubs, through to preschools, schools, secondary schools and universities. And again, it's that concept of the different systems that Michelle talked about that create this security and safety for children. Within the schools, nearly half of adolescents do not know how to report sexual harassment in schools, and nearly 3/4 don't know if their school has a sexual harassment policy. That's got to be concerning for all school principals and the Department of Education. The impetus for this report was the dearth of research measuring the prevalence, nature and character of sexual harassment perpetrated against Irish teenagers. The lack of robust research that encompasses all forms of sexual harassment, online or physical, has made it difficult to determine the scale of the problem. And therefore, there is also a lack of preventative solutions, such as consent education. Though I'm aware that NUIG are working very hard on this particular issue at the moment and hope to launch a consent education program for second level students very soon, and that'll be very welcome. A point I've made consistently, and Cliona touched on it since becoming Ombudsman in 2015, is that the Department of Education needs to improve the collection, collation and analysis of data about bullying in schools, but it also needs to separate out information on sexual bullying and sexual harassment. In 2016, my office recommended to the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child that the state authorities should collate specific information and data on bullying countrywide to determine the issues and solutions that were occurring in schools. The committee agreed with that and recommended same to be done in 2016, and they have once again, in preparation for their next review of the Irish state in 2022, requested disaggregated data from the state about cases of bullying and harassment in school. And that's going to be hugely important that we start to gather that quickly. In light of the number of consultations I've done since 2016 in our office, we've heard children saying that within their school, they've experienced issues such as racism, homophobia, and negative commentary about their mental health. We believe this collection of data by the Department of Education is long overdue. Indeed, we can but speculate about how much progress could have been achieved in areas such as sexual harassment, homophobia, racism, sectarianism, sexism, if such a collection mechanism had been developed earlier. They say that sunlight is the best disinfectant, and therefore it's only by having clear, robust data that we can start to shine that cleansing light on the extent of sexual harassment and bullying in schools and take the necessary steps to address it and stamp it out for all of our children. It really is an uncomfortable reality, but sexual harassment and assault is taking place among young people. In line with the results today that Dr. Walsh's report has created, CSO figures released earlier this year show that 20% of detected sexual violence reported in 2019 involved juveniles as both offenders and victims. Today's report notes sexual violence is commonly directed towards young women, and harassment is more common among young people who identify as a member of the LGBTQI+ community. Therefore, the evidence is clear that many of our schools do not create a sufficiently positive environment that destigmatizes and addresses topics and issues that are the cause of much stress and anxiety for young people who may be struggling with their sexuality. This report suggests that sexual harassment can occur as part of a continuum of behavior, and it hypothesizes that it can occur where social norms promote a rigid gender role, which in turn can offer a degree of acceptance of various forms of sexual violence. The report also suggests that there is a growth of individualistic outlooks in the adolescents. And the way I've understood that is that it means a more self-centered or selfish mindset as a result of shifts in societal norms and how we communicate and use technology as individuals versus doing so in groups, and that move away from sort of peer and group work to individualized IT-based interactions. And as I come to the conclusion of my speech now, I think it's chilling to consider that we are possibly raising a more self-centered population of children, and that as a society, we are not affording them sufficient opportunities to experience the growth that comes with open, frank, and clear discussions around their sexuality, their moral responsibility towards others, and the importance of protecting those weakest in society. To protect all of our children from sexual harassment and assault, those things need to be modeled at home, within our schools and across our society. Always remember the key rule of teaching or parenting for any adult is they don't do what we say, they do what we do. So we need to challenge our own selfish and self-centered mindset. We need to challenge our rigid gender roles or our beliefs about what gender a person can be in their lifetime. We need to challenge misogynistic or transphobic comments at every occasion. We need to model for our children how to ask for consent in all the right situations. We need to teach them about being respectful of their own and others' bodies when being intimate. We cannot shy away from that. Finally, we need to show empathy and caring for those deemed weaker by others, and we need to ensure that all our children see us modeling such behavior as often as possible. In conclusion, I'm very happy to launch this report, and I again commend Dr. Walsh and all of the RCNI for the huge effort that was involved in bringing it to fruition. I really look forward to the recommendations being taken on board by the state and the consequential reduction in the levels of sexual harassment in secondary schools. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very, very much for that. I think you've really captured a lot of it. I'm reminded of Dr. Mike Ryan of the WHO, who we've all been watching a lot recently, and he reuses that cliche of, if we don't count it, we don't action it. So I will hand you straight over now to Professor Conor O'Mahony, who is the Government Child Rapporteur, and his second report, I believe, is in with government at the moment. So I'm really interested to hear from how you responded to these findings as well, Conor. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Cliona. So I'd just like to begin by congratulating Dr. Michelle Walsh on the completion of her PhD, as well as on the publication of this report. When I was working on my 2021 annual report for government, I was searching around for some data around the experiences of adolescents of sexual abuse and harassment in Ireland, and couldn't find anything. And after a little bit of crowdsourcing on Twitter, Michelle very kindly got in touch and sent me on a copy of her PhD. So I had an opportunity to see the completed lengthy document, which is a really, really fabulous piece of work, and which provides an incredibly in-depth and robust basis for this shorter report. But the process of shortening it, and Cliona mentioned earlier on that that's a difficult thing to do, but a very important thing to do in order to bring the research to a wider audience. So up to now in Ireland, we've probably had a lot of anecdote and impression around this issue, but not a lot of robust data. And so now this report gives us a first pass at providing some really strong data on the nature and scale of this problem. It echoes findings from other jurisdictions. There was a report published earlier this year by Ofsted in England, and that documented what they called the normalization of sexual harassment and online sexual abuse in schools. And so there's a real correspondence, I suppose, between the findings of these two reports. As Niall mentioned earlier on, to many people working in the sector, some of these findings don't come as a huge surprise, but they are still jarring when you see all of the detail laid out together in one place like this. But I think to the more general public, I think to people who aren't closely engaged with this issue, it will be quite shocking to see just how many adolescents experience sexual harassment in a short period of time of just 12 months. And it may also be shocking to see the incidence of sexual harassment which is perpetrated by adolescents. So in that respect, the report is a really important wake-up call. I think this is the kind of issue where if policymakers or legislators don't see it, there's a risk they don't do anything about it, and complacency can be a really serious hurdle to progressive change. And it may be the case that up to now that policymakers or legislators just weren't aware of the reality of adolescent lives. And if they don't see the problem themselves, then they may not realize that they need to act to address it and to address the reality of the lives of the adolescents in our families and communities. Now, it's significant, obviously, as a way of informing reforms in policy and law, but it's also significant legally and has an important role in triggering the state's legal obligations to act to address this issue. And so in particular here, I'm referring to the European Convention on Human Rights, which imposes obligations on states to take steps to mitigate the risk that people would experience sexual abuse or harassment. And that obligation is triggered in circumstances where the state either is aware of the risk or ought to be aware of the risk. And in particular, that principle I'm deriving from the European Court of Human Rights decision in 2014 in the Louise O'Keeffe case, which was of course an Irish case. And in that case, what the court held was that the state was aware by virtue of the 1931 Carrigan Committee report of the fact that there was a very high incidence of sexual crime against children. And because of that, the state was then deemed to be obliged to take reasonable steps to mitigate that risk that children in schools might experience sexual abuse. And the state's failure to have done so led to a finding in that case of a violation of Article 3 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, that case obviously was in the context of abuse perpetrated by a teacher. But by the same token, if the state either is aware or ought to be aware of the risk that students may be abused or harassed by other students, then similarly the state is obliged to ask or to act to mitigate that risk. And if the state is aware or ought to be aware that certain cohorts of students are at an increased risk, well then obviously that obligation is heightened in that context. So this report certainly provides the evidence that the risk is very real, that it's very pressing, and that it's not going to go away by itself. And so from that perspective, that certainly, in my view, triggers the state's obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights to take reasonable measures to mitigate the risks which have been identified in the report. You know, so in short, the state can hardly now claim, in light of evidence of this nature, that it was not or ought not to have been aware that there is a pervasive risk of sexual harassment faced by Irish adolescents. Now, the European Convention on Human Rights is one angle for introducing this obligation. The Convention on the Rights of the Child is another. The Convention on the Rights of the Child obliges in Article 19 that states take all appropriate measures to protect children from all forms of violence, including sexual abuse. And this includes the establishment of social programs to provide support for children and other forms of prevention, identification, investigation, and treatment. So there's a lot of work to do. And in Michelle's presentation earlier on, she referenced the fact that a huge amount of this abuse is happening online. So online abuse is clearly a hugely important issue. Niall discussed this a little bit in his presentation. And the Oireachtas is currently working on the Online Safety and Media Regulation Bill, which is an important opportunity to provide stronger regulation of online activity and ways of tackling online abuse. But there are significant gaps in the bill in its current form. In particular, the bill doesn't provide for an individual complaints mechanism that would lead to a legal obligation to remove harmful material where complaints are upheld. So that's an important gap in the bill which really needs to be addressed. And I've made written and oral submissions to the relevant Oireachtas committee on that point. More generally then, the other strategy for tackling this issue, which I'd like to mention, is broadly speaking the whole area of education. So this has been highlighted in particular by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, which has called on state parties to implement educational measures for children directed to improve their pro-social attitudes, competencies and behaviours. And those of you who read Dr. Walsh's report will notice the very strong overlap between that recommendation and some of the recommendations in the report. Specifically in relation to Ireland, in 2016, the committee called on Ireland to adopt a comprehensive sexual and reproductive health policy for adolescents and to ensure that sexual and reproductive health education is part of the mandatory school curriculum. Now, when we talk about education in this context, there are a number of colleagues of mine in the School of Law and UCC who've been engaged in some very cutting edge work in the use of education as a way of addressing sexual harassment. So just to mention a couple of those quickly, Professor Louise Crowley has led the introduction of a bystander intervention program in UCC, which has been a huge success and which has since been replicated in other Irish universities and is also there's evidence about its successes in other jurisdictions as well. The aim of the bystander intervention program is to highlight the danger of normalizing or accepting abusive behavior and through education to inform and to empower young people to better understand their capacity to intervene as pro-social bystanders. So that has a lot of promise and a lot of potential and is certainly something we could look at rolling out on a broader level, not just in universities, but also in schools. Now, this is one educational measure, but it's not the only one. A recently published paper by other colleagues of mine, Dr. Aoife Daly and Dr. Catherine O'Sullivan, has explored the idea of sexuality education as a right of the child. And they point to the importance of sexuality education, including sexual health, relationships and consent. And they note that the failure to properly educate children on these issues can mean that they are unprotected or that they can cause harm to others. So this is something which we have struggled with as a country in Ireland. In a very detailed report published in 2019, the National Council for Curriculum and Assessment, they concluded that for most students, their experience of relationships and sexuality education can be summed up as too little, too late, and too biological. So the dominant approach is concerned with risks and dangers and doesn't allow for a sufficient discussion of positive, healthy, and enjoyable aspects of relationships, as well as the challenges. So the NCAA recommended that the curriculum should be redeveloped to address these issues, including the impact of the internet and social media, including consent, LGBTQ+ matters, healthy and positive sexual expression, and so on. So the NCCA has established 2 development groups, one for primary schools and one for post-primary, to oversee development work arising from its 2019 report. And so that work is ongoing. They're hoping to have a revised junior cycle curriculum by 2022 and a revised senior cycle curriculum by 2023. This work is welcome, it's needed, and my annual report, which Cliona mentioned, has been submitted to government for this year and will publish later in the year, endorses the recommendations of the NCCA's report from 2019. So the hope really will be that all parties will work together to see those recommendations implemented. But we know that from past experience that this can be a challenging space in terms of the role of parents and the relationship between the state and parents in this respect. But from a children's rights lens, the role that education has to play in addressing the risk that children will experience sexual abuse or harassment is clear. And certainly if we are to prioritise children's rights and best interests, then this is a space in which we cannot fail to act. So I'm a little over my time. I will have to leave it there. I just want to again congratulate the RCNI on the work that has gone into this report and into today's seminar. So certainly I will be doing everything I can to advocate to see this research disseminated and its recommendations furthered. And I'm happy to engage in the Q&A afterwards. Thanks very much.
Thank you very, very much for that. And I think we have some really, really clear direction from our speakers here on a number. And I think we have also agreement, a lot of agreement across the speakers on what we think is the way forward. So they're very kindly agreed to be on a panel. So I'm just waiting for Lorraine to figure out how to get us all back on your screen again. So that you can see it. I probably, Conor, if I can ask you to turn your camera on and your mic on as well, that might, yeah, thank you. Okay, so as I said earlier, if you have questions, please drop them into the questions and answers or chat function. We can probably drop them into either at this stage. We do have some in already, so I'll just walk you through some of those initially. I have a few of my own, but I'll let the chat, the audience in first. I think the first is probably from Michelle, and that is, where issues of ethnicity considered in the and I suppose other minority and intersectional issues, because we only highlighted the LGBTQ+ in this presentation here. So did you look at other intersectional characteristics?
No, not really. To be honest, I suppose there was a few different ethnic backgrounds within the research, but we didn't single that out because I felt that there was just enough I didn't want to dilute it really, and I just wanted to have a look at what was happening in the broader sense in adolescence. So I didn't kind of diversify too much in that direction.
I suspect even with 600 people, you are still looking to get the numbers up to get statistics.
Yeah, well, I suppose it was quite easy in terms of numbers. I think I could have rolled with more data collection if I had so chosen, but within the confines of a PhD and being a single researcher on my own, I really had to kind of draw a line at the 600, and I had to draw a line at the capacity, my own capacity for what I could research into, and this was quite a substantial amount of research to take part to do on my own without any backup.
Yeah, it's probably we have been over and over the recommendations we put in this report, but it's probably another recommendation we needed to add in was further research required on these aspects that we didn't capture. The other question, that early on question that came in was, and you both touched on it to some extent, is what do we think is the impact of pornography here, in particular around perpetration?
Which one of us are you aiming that at?
I'm letting anyone jump in there.
Well, for me, I see a devastating impact. I suppose the adolescents that took part in the survey, these were all adolescents who had partaken in a sexual awareness program within the last 12 months as well, which is striking when you consider, you know, that these are children who had some sort of education given to them. And, you know, going around and talking to the adolescents and doing workshops with them. And basically girls and boys, adolescents are telling me porn is fine. It's absolutely fine. They don't see the implications, the long-term implications of it. They don't see, you know, what I generally said to an awful lot of adolescents is, if porn is so great, why don't we put it on a CAO? And then they start to actually really, you know, why isn't it on a CAO application? And then they really start to think about what they might actually be fueling. So I think there's an awful lot of education that needs to happen, especially in terms of consent as well. Adolescents don't realize when they're watching porn that consent has happened first. So they actually, it colors their worldview as to what is normal in a relationship.
Mm-hmm. Niall, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I suppose again, it's good to hear that Michelle has had that discussion with the young people, because it's crucial to hear from them. You know, anecdotally, we do suspect that children are much more easily able to access it, and I do think what they're accessing now is also, I mean, this is going to really show my age, but old-fashioned way. There used to be a story from start to finish when you watch pornography in a video, but now there's sort of clips that go straight to the action, so to speak. And there's no discussion on who's in charge, who asked what, where did it come from, who's protecting who. You know, that's leaving out anything to do with an interaction of long-term relationships. So I think, yeah, we do have to start acknowledging that and putting it into our discussions with the young people at a very early age. Because again, if we assume that we're now seeing products being built for 2 and 3 year olds swiping IT equipment, by the time they become 11 and 12, their access to whatever is accessible will be very easy and natural. So we need to start those conversations early. So I was delighted to hear that Conor was saying that the NCCA are following up on the 2019 report. I was aware of the report where they were critical of the sexual education program, but it's delighted to see that something's coming forward, because we do need to have that, and we can't hide behind our old ways of looking at things. The children of the future need us to talk about sex education, consent, abuse, pornography, harassment now, and we need to do that in a staged way from sort of 7 years of age upwards. You know, what's appropriate, what's fair, what's empathic, you know, how can we show respect at all times? I think that's so.
I think it's very important as well, Niall, you know, when you're thinking about pornography, to consider that continuum in that piece, that, you know, what they're watching when they're 11, 12, 13, which is the age that they are watching it, is not what they're going to be satisfied watching when they're 15, 16. And so that contributes to that escalation in sexual violence.
I'll segue this into, there's a lot of questions in here around the education system and the RSE programs, and Conor spoke a lot about the NCCA report there, which is a really critical turning point for us, I think, in terms of addressing this issue. But for us, and the working groups are sitting around the table at the moment developing that content, and we hope that content will be everything we hope it is here and fit for purpose. But the questions, I think, are, you know, coming from our experience so far, which is, you know, how do we ensure that, you know, schools aren't overloaded, aren't overburdened, that there's, if you like, a resistance to, you know, what is the infrastructure around it. And I think the NCCA report looked very closely at how we support the teachers and how we train the teachers and how we make space in the curriculum for the curriculum delivery. So it's not just about what's in the curriculum, it's actually about support structure around it. And I think if I can, one of the things that we're saying around this, when we talk about a framework for schools, is the curriculum content is only the first step. You need to look at what's happening in the corridors. You need to look at what's happening in the culture across schools. It needs to be proactive and preventive. You need to have systems of reporting. Children are telling us they don't know where to go. We need to have systems of response and support, because it's not simply about that moment of reporting. It's about what happens over the next year, 2 years, 3 years in that child's life as they go through that school, and with potentially the perpetrator or people who engaged in, if you like, taking sides, continuing to be part of that child's community in that school and that learning community. How does the school respond and hold that? And how do we intervene in terms of those who are perpetrating? And there is very clearly an issue here around workers' rights. There is clearly an issue here that goes beyond just focusing on children and their responsibilities and legal responsibilities as employers for both youth workers and teachers and everyone else working in areas with children. And I think there's a section at the bottom of the report which delves into that, because I think part of what schools, what I hear from the schools, and maybe Conor and Niall, you'll reflect on this, come back on this also, is just an exhaustion. You know, how do we grapple? This is so big. How do we take this on? And are we being asked to carry something for the whole of society that's bigger than us?
I mean, briefly on that point, that it is, if we're going to be upping the ante in terms of what we do in an educational setting here, I mean, there is an element of that can look like it's going to impose huge demands on teachers, but there are ways of balancing that out as well. I mean, on the one hand, there is already an RSE curriculum within schools, so there's an element of taking an existing curriculum and reforming that. But then to the extent that we start bringing into play additional elements, I mean, I think the experience we had in UCC with the bystander intervention program, which I mentioned, was interesting in this respect, because what we did for that was we had dedicated staff whose job it was to deliver that program. Now, that's at a university of 20,000 students. Obviously, you're not going to have one dedicated person in every school, but it doesn't have to be the case that all of these measures are things which teachers in schools have to deliver. There can be an element if you provide the support at a regional level, or, you know, for example, you get somebody who is, you know, trained to the highest standard on a particular issue, and whose job it is then to take that around to schools. So in that sense, it's not an additional burden on the teachers in the schools, it's an additional resource being brought into the school to supplement the work that they're already doing. So I think that kind of model has potential to address some of the overload concerns, which I think teachers might very legitimately have.
Just on top of that, I think that's a fantastic idea, and I think it's one of the ways to look at it, because, you know, you could certainly get youth workers and people who are well experienced in this area to take up that sort of extra additional work. However, one of the things I've also been pushing for with the Educational Committee is the access to therapeutic services for children in every primary school and secondary school, so that, again, the burden comes off the teacher. If something is acknowledged, somebody does talk about something, somebody's come up forward and said, I've been harassed, they have a trained professional accessible to them very quickly. Again, it's worked all over the British Isles. They have therapists available to primary schools in most parts of the UK. And it really takes the burden off that concept that the teacher has to carry everything, because, as you said, they are exhausted. So again, and it's also this RSE and the sex education within schools is also a kicking off point for parents to be engaged. The whole community service has to buy into this discussion and this eradication of rigid gender roles, you know, homophobic, transphobic, whatever the issues are. It's the whole of society has to have this discussion as well, because 40% of the harassment is happening online, which is where we can all influence that. You know, schools get the fallout from it a lot of the time, but it's the whole of society needs to look at it as well. And Michelle highlighted that very well in the way she looked at the different systems.
And you mentioned parents there. Sorry, you mentioned parents there. There are a few questions in about parents. You know, how do we support parents in this?
Again, I think it's I'm a great believer in the concept of a school community, which includes the children, the teachers, and the parents, and any other staff members that might be involved. I think, and that's where the whole community comes in together. The sports clubs that are in the area, they all work together. So that if the parents are aware that an RSE program is happening, they work with them, they're engaged with it, they're encouraged by it. Similarly, they can feed back into it. It's that sort of circle that wraps around a child and makes it holistic intervention that can really make a difference.
I think probably a lot of the parenting support is happening out of Tusla. I think there's a new initiative there only last week on it. But I think it's probably something we just need to knit everything all together so that we have the wrap around the child. Conor, you've mentioned already some aspects that are happening in third level in higher education. I think Niall, you mentioned it as well, and there's a question in here from Gertie, or at least a point of information probably from Gertie. We have, for many of you who are here, will be aware that there's a big piece of work happening called the Framework for Consent for short, around higher education, and that is about putting in place the type of framework we're talking about for second level here, where it's a whole of system approach, where you have people who are engaged in this, whose job it is, whose role it is. There is counting, there is evaluation, there is, and what Gertie has said, they're about to launch in, I think Gertie, you're in my notes, but correct me if I'm wrong there, the anonymous reporting tool for higher education. Obviously, we're talking mostly adults when we're in higher education, so it's a very, that there are some very big differences. But there's also, if you like, a roadmap in terms of the higher education work that has happened around the framework for consent. So I think half the work's been done, and that some of the heavy lifting here has been done by the resources that have been activated across higher education.
No, we don't need to reinvent the wheel completely here, and I think that's important. Where there are things out there which are working, and where a lot of that work has been done to prepare the ground, we should be drawing on those. And it was mentioned, one of Michelle's findings was that the issue here is most pressing among 16 and 17-year-olds rather than younger adolescents. I mean, university students, you're 18, 19-year-olds, you're not talking about a completely different context with an 18 and 19-year-old compared to a 16 and 17-year-old. It's a little bit different, but it's not so different that we need to go back to the drawing board completely. So I think that point is very important.
But I do think that education needs to start earlier in schools. I think consent and a consent framework needs to be introduced from primary up. And I do think you're right, there are some structures there, but I mean, the stories that I was getting, because I asked adolescents about where they were getting their education, and I remember quite frankly an awful lot of them saying that we want comprehensive sexual education in school. One young man said to me, you know what, if this was a subject on the curriculum for the Leaving Cert, we'd all know about it and we'd have points. And at the same time, I really think we really need to consider the way that we're teaching this. We're not unless the teacher has a vested interest in it, there's a very, very good chance that they'll get 1 or 2 classes, or they'll be left to do their homework in other classes. And we really need to look at this.
I'm looking at Paul Ralston, your question in here, and I think your conclusion is this, has the importance of all working together and the necessity to ensure that this happens being highlighted and impressed on government. I think that's probably the national strategy that I mentioned a few times. I think probably the pitch here is that this gets written into the national strategy on domestic, sexual and gender-based violence, because that's the way that we connect up all of the parts of government to work collectively together on this. And there's also been a recent audit in government around how government works effectively across all of government to make that happen. There was a question here about the commodification of childhood and children and how that contributes in here. I'm trying to just scroll up to find the exact question, but one of you might have seen it yourselves. I think it probably relates to the pornography question as well. And I can't, oh, here it is. How children are commodified by the advertising sector with all its wide-reaching influences and associations. I think there's, I suppose there's a question in terms of, Michelle touches a bit on the individualization, but I think there's something about how pornography, the individualization, online space, how that culture is all meshing to create vulnerability, I suppose, in terms of targeting and in terms of perpetration and being vulnerable
I know when I read the literature, I mean, within an hour of an adolescent watching television, they're exposed to maybe 6, 7 sexualized scenes. They're exposed to ads that present a body as a part of the body. I think that all of this type of advertising and media, as well as pornography, definitely feeds into the issue of sexual harassment, and again needs to be addressed. I don't know if that really answers what you're asking.
I suppose I would just add to that. I wonder, we are moving into a new world of advertising too, because the advertising is much more personalized. You know, again, it's online advertising. Most of your children will not be watching TV. They'll not be watching the generic ads that you and I watch. They will watch specialized programs, which in turn leads to specialized advertisement. And again, it's that piece where we need to start looking at the industry of online media, IT companies, personalized ads, algorithms, mega data, joined up IT things. So your phone, the information from your phone ties into the information from your GPS, which ties in turn to your Alexa. All these things start to become very important when you think about children's safety and the way that they're targeted for advertisement. So yeah, there's a lot of work to be done in that regard.
I have we invited some of the unions along because I said this is a workplace issue as well. So I just Dermot Puer of ASTI wanted to come in and just say something. Are you there?
Yeah. I am. Yes, I am. Yeah. Just a couple of things. I'm very glad the mention of workers, because one of the things that certainly in the last few years, there has definitely been an increase for us of teachers who have suffered sexual harassment or sexual assault from students, which is very worrying, not just for the teachers, which it obviously is an argument, but it's also worrying for the students and for the culture that leads to that. And in terms of resourcing and being an issue of resource, and I know we always talk about resources, I actually think this needs major resources, because it's all very well to say, well, we'll bring in experts and we'll do people, but actually this has to be a whole school thing. The problem with it is that the sexual harassment is not going to happen necessarily where the teacher who is trained happens to be there. So there needs to be some form of whole school training, and there has to be a change in school cultures. It's a kind of tangential, but I got a letter the other day, an anonymous letter from a gay teacher, and who basically is terrified of the notion of coming out. And we have found it extraordinarily difficult to make contact with our gay teachers. There is a fairly vibrant LGBT group at primary level, but when it hits secondary, teachers are afraid. And that is part of a culture of fear, which obviously leads to the information coming from the wrong places, because it's not coming from the gay teacher talking to their students. It's not coming from, and even now this recent, if you saw recent reports of people objecting to the texts on junior cycle. And we actually had a brief discussion of it in here, and somebody pointed out, well, we might as well get rid of Shakespeare. But then we had teachers there when this discussion happened at our executives saying, I find these texts so useful because they deal with issues like rape or incest or, you know, or sex, and I can talk to the students about it rather than coming in and saying, now I'm going to talk to you about sex. So it has to be a whole school thing. It has to be holistic. And I think that does require probably an awful lot of investment, a lot of whole school training. It means taking schools for a day and closing the school for a day and getting all the staff and teaching them about issues about consent and about harassment and about the culture of their own culture of the school and how they transmit that to the students. At the same time, I also have to say, we're not going to solve the problem in schools because it is a much, much bigger problem. I mean, schools obviously talk to children an awful lot where, particularly the ones who don't have safe home environments, it's their safe place, but it has to be much, much bigger than the schools.
Thank you. I think we're singing on the same hymn sheet there, and I think probably we'll be talking to you going forward. I'm going to give, we're wrapping up here, so I'm going to give everyone just a closing, if you like, on it. So Conor, I know you want to come in there. So
yeah, just to briefly respond to Dermot's point, and just to mention that the bystander intervention model, which I discussed earlier, fits very well with what Dermot is saying there. And the idea of it is that you're empowering not only the teachers, but also the students themselves to act, to call out behavior which crosses the line and which becomes unacceptable. I mean, it can happen sometimes that you have somebody who's making inappropriate comments or engaging in behavior which is harassing somebody else, and there might be lots of other people present who are all thinking that's not okay, but they're not doing anything about it. And then that contributes to that process of normalization. Bystander intervention is about empowering people to call out that behavior and to act, to intervene, rather than standing back and allowing things to happen and allowing things to become normalized. It's saying that if you see something that isn't okay, here are the tools that you need to be able to intervene, so that there can be an element, not only, so it's not putting all the onus on the staff, it's in fact empowering the students to say to each other, no, that kind of behavior is not acceptable. It's not acceptable to behave like that towards other students or towards teachers or towards anybody else. So I think it fits well with what Dermot is describing there, that it can't all be about you bring in somebody for a session once a year and then that's all you do. It must be a more ongoing thing.
Yeah, thank you. Michelle, do you have parting words?
I could wax lyrical about parting words. I just really, really hope this research is that something actually happens. I think we owe it to the adolescents, we owe it to every adolescent in the country to actually stand up and do something about this.
Thank you. Ombudsman?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fantastic piece of work, and congratulations to you all. I think there's one of the things that stands out to me is that concept that there's 5% of those children that actually witnessed a rape. We have that really is stark. And again, if we're going to be bystanders standing up, it's us adults have to stand up and model what it is to intervene as a bystander. And we need to do that as government level, intervene and support the new culture that changes the way it is for the future of the children being born today. So hopefully we will see changes.
Thank you very much. And so just thank you all very, very much for participating in the panel, and thank you for turning up in the audience as well. And just to say, the report is live on the website at the moment, and indeed Michelle's entire thesis can be accessed as well if you want to read 631 pages, if that's where you're at. I would say, just my closing here would be, with Michelle's PhD, she created a space where adolescents could tell us about their reality and their lived experience. And I think that's been vital. I think that's been in some ways missing. We have been afraid to ask and to listen to adolescents about this, but we have to, because it's their reality. And not only did they give us a picture of their reality, but they also very clearly gave us their hope and their passion, their commitment, their belief that this can be different. And all they're asking us for is our activity and our action and our support to do that. So I'm really looking forward to working with all of you in the future as we make that happen, as we put in place that wraparound response that will support children to create their new world going forward. Thank you all very, very much.